Well, good morning. I had a few questions about selectors, CSS selectors, and how we apply styles to HTML elements, both IDs, classes, whether or not we use inline styles, style blocks, or external CSS files. So I wanted to dive in just a little bit deeper onto those. This is a very basic overview of how those elements will work. So I have on my screen right now a very simple HTML file. We're just defining the doc type, HTML, head, the title, and then a body element with a couple tags inside it, H1s, P tags. We are using the emphasis tag around a few things, as well as some empty spans that right now don't do anything. We see the basic rendering of that here, where we have Massachusetts is italicized because it's wrapped in an emphasis tag. Same thing with profound down here. So what I want to do is walk through how we would change the look and feel of those of all of these elements using CSS. So first, what I'll start with are inline styles, where each element in HTML, one of the attributes that we can apply is a style attribute. So for example, if I wanted to take the H1 and I actually wanted to change what that's going to look like, perhaps we want to make it bigger. So I'm just going to say font size, and we're going to change that to 50 pixels. And if I save that and we refresh our sample side, we can see that that got bigger. So I can also, if I want, we can add additional classes, or excuse me, CSS attributes to it. So if we want to change the color of that text to red and save that, now when we reload it, we have CSS examples in red. We can do this for each element here. So if I wanted each of these paragraphs to have a style, I can add the style attribute and then define the CSS here. And for this, we'll just say font size is, we'll say 10 pixels. There are a lot of different sizing, whether you use pixels, EMs, REMs, all those things, and that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. So if I refresh this, we see that that paragraph got really small, and then if I wanted to apply that to every single paragraph on the page, I can just copy and paste that style into each one, and now when I refresh it, those are all very tiny. Now, copying and pasting style attributes on each of your elements would get very tedious, also prone to error. And if I wanted to then say, well, actually I want this font size to be 16, then I would have to go in and find all of the instances of 10 and that are applied to my paragraph tags and change them to 16. So now when I refresh that, now it's a little bit bigger, they're all 16 pixels. When we're dealing with dynamically generated pages or even more extensive HTML static pages, that level of maintenance becomes overbearing. So we want to avoid having to define a style attribute on every single element, especially if we're going to be repeating all of these. So our first level of defining style on an element is using the style attribute. That's generally speaking not really where you're going to want to style things. So I'm going to remove all of my style from this page. I'm just going to undo until they all go away. And we're going to get rid of the style here. Let me save that. The second option we have is actually defining a style block. We can do that. I'm just going to do it right here in the body, and so I get a style block. Now with that style block, I can come in and I can actually target specific elements. Now we can target elements a couple ways. Right now I'm just going to show you the basic one, which is targeting elements by the HTML element. So now if I have an H1 and I want to change that font size, I'm defining a rule, a style rule for the H1 element, and I'm going to set the attribute of the font size back up to 50 pixels. And so now if I refresh this, we see that that got bigger because I've got my style tag right here, and within that style block, I am targeting the H1, and so any H1s that it sees on the page, it's going to make them bigger. I can now do the same thing with a P tag. So a P, I can come in here and say, okay, font size, and I'm going to make that 10 pixels. And now when I refresh this, all of my paragraphs with one place are 10 pixels. So I can look at that and say, you know what, 10 pixels is too small, so I want to change that to 16, and when I refresh, now they're all 16 pixels. This gives that added benefit of being able to say, all right, now I have one place to edit that and make that change. These changes would be specific to this file. That's what happens with the style block is the style that's defined on the page is going to be applied. So now let's think about, well, I want to target specific things. So likewise, I'm going to, just for kicks and giggles, I'm going to define something for the EM where I'm going to say font, or not font, I'm going to make that all the italic items red. So I'm going to set that to red, we'll refresh that, and we see that Massachusetts and Profound are both italicized and red now. So now I have these span classes, and what I'd like to do is say, well, here's another thing that we could do is we can set an ID. So the ID is an attribute on each HTML object, and the ID will identify a single item on, or should identify a single element on the page. So here I'm going to just call this science and save that. When I refresh that, again, nothing's changed because all I did was add an ID attribute with a name. If I want to target that within CSS, I use the octothorpe or the hash or the pound sign, however you want to call it, and we're going to say science. And then I define my rule within that. So here I'm going to say that it's going to be, I think it's, let's see, font style and italic. So I'm going to just make that one italic as well. So when we refresh that, we see min of science has been italicized. So now I say, well, I also want to do that same thing with cautious investigators. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to say ID equals science. And when I refresh that, now cautious investigators as well as min of science are both italicized. Now we do have a problem that I've introduced here, a potential problem, where my ID that's supposed to identify a unique element on the page is now identifying two items. This becomes more problematic when we start dealing with JavaScript, where you want to use the CSS selectors like ID and class to target elements in the DOM, which is the document object model. In order to avoid this, we would say, well, you know what, this is now that we have more of these elements that are all kind of one name, let's become a class of elements. So I'm going to change this ID to a class. And let's change that down here as well. I keep hitting caps lock. So here we go, we have a class, and now when I refresh this, I'm going to lose my styling because I have not updated how am I targeting this. So the octothorpe is there to target IDs. If I want to target a class, I would hit science. And now when I refresh that, we have these things again italicized. The nice thing about classes is it doesn't matter what types of elements that we're targeting. So I could come here to this last one that doesn't have any italics or anything in it, and I could say class, and this last paragraph element equals science, and save that. And when we refresh, again, now this entire paragraph is italicized. Well, what if I still want to maintain that that element, that paragraph tag, is of class science? However, because it's not a span, I don't want to italicize it. So what I could do is we could put an element right in front of our dot. So without a space, span.science is looking for all span elements with class science. So if I save that and refresh, you'll see this italics went away, even though we still have the class science here below. And then the other spans stayed the same. So that brings up another interesting point about what is the default rendering that HTML, the browser, is doing. One best practice is to look at what is the browser doing with the tags that are out of the box, and leverage those tags to get the base level of rendering that we need out of an element. So if we're defining a span solely to italicize, and let's just to make this look the same, let's see, color is red. So now when I refresh this, the EM tags and the spans look the same. They're both italicized and they're both red. One thing that we can do just from a semantic standpoint in rendering is not everybody will have CSS. That comes down to more accessibility issues. By and large, you'll be fine. But letting the HTML define the structure of the page. So if the emphasis is a structural component of the text, such as it is here, we'd want to leverage the EM tag. And perhaps we say, okay, well, I don't want all emphasis tags on the page to be red and emphasized. I just want the emphasis tags that have to do with science. So I can say class equals science, and now if I go em.science, and let's just get rid of this span here entirely, and I can switch these spans to em. Let's make sure they all switch nicely. And this one, em, and switch that in tag as well. And when I refresh that, we see that profound, which is, here we go, right here in our HTML, is still wrapped in an emphasis tag. But because it's not of class science, we no longer get the red for it. So we can start to target specific EM. We could also say that, all right, well, by and large, I want all EM to be font size 20 pixels. So I want them all a little bit bigger so they stand out more. So profound stands out more, but it still doesn't get the red. And that's because the red is only targeting EM tags of class science. And then if we had a ID as well, we can also add additional styling just to that individual instance. So if we have ID, we can say the ID is M1, and I can come down here, do my M1, and I want that to be color green. And here we go, we're going to refresh that, and now min of science is green. And we're targeting that. We're seeing that the ID is overriding the green. If for whatever reason we wanted this to stay to the EM science just from an inheritance standpoint with CSS, we can add the important tag, whoops, not important, important, save that, and now when CSS is rendering that, it's going to say, okay, the red is what's important, and regardless of how it's overwritten later, I want you to keep that. And so when I refresh that, we again lose the green and we're just red, even though we have the ID defined here. This important tag is overriding that definition. So I'm going to switch that back, refresh it, we're back to green. Let's see. We can also target multiple items, so I can say all H1s and P tags will have, let's see here, all H1s and P tags are going to be, gosh, I don't know, let's say color blue. And now, again, we have all those are going to be defined as colored blue because I'm targeting two with a comma in between them. If I wanted to say all H1s and P tags of class blue, then I can just add in a class blue, save that, and when I refresh, all of my P tags lose that blue except for the one that has blue. So now I'm able to define all of the CSS and styling by designating the element as well as a combined class that I want to target with that. So the other part that we want to look at is this style block, as we mentioned before, is only going to apply to this specific page. So if we have a web application or a website with multiple pages, but we want the same CSS to be applied across all of our site, the style block is not something we want to include on every single page. Because again, if we wanted to update that, we would have to go into every single page and make those changes. So to avoid that, I'm going to take our CSS definitions that we have in our style, and I'm going to remove those out of here, and I'm going to put them in this CSS file that is on my file system. It is a sibling to my index. I'm going to save that. Well, I'm also going to remove this style tag, and I'm going to refresh this. So without any CSS, we still get a base level of hierarchy. We get a base level of rendering by the browser. So it's still able to keep that my EMs are italicized or emphasized for whatever reason. Now, if I want to link a CSS file, I can add a link tag here, and I'm just going to use a shortcut here to get it all. But we have a link of a style sheet. The type is text CSS, and the path is example.css. I'm going to save that. Now when I refresh, it's going to load that style sheet in and apply the styles. So when I refresh that, it comes back. This allows us to apply a base level of styling across our entire site. If I wanted to, I could override that with another child file. So I could, let's just do that. I'm going to save this as child.css. And with that, I can, let's take this H1. And I'm just going to overwrite that. So I'm going to make my H1 100, well, not 1,000, let's say 100 pixels. So I'm going to double that size. So I'm going to refresh this, and nothing's happened. Well, I haven't referenced it yet. So if I come in here, and let's just copy and paste, because that is a developer's favorite tool, and I say child.css, now it's going to load the example.css and then load the child.css, and it's going to apply it in the order that it's loaded. So if I refresh that, bam, our CSS examples got really big. Now, if I want to move that up, so I'm going to load child.css first, then example.css, and I refresh that, our CSS examples is actually overriding the H1 defined in child is being overridden by the example.css. So this allows us to control when things are happening, and if, for example, you're using a library like Bootstrap, you load Bootstrap first, and then you can load your own custom CSS file below Bootstrap and override any CSS that you don't necessarily want Bootstrap defaults. And that's a way to start with a base theme or CSS template and override to the point where you're happy with what you're seeing. Again, this is making heavy use, it's good to make use of your classes. It's good to make use of your IDs. This will be good practice for when you start working with JavaScript and you need to start targeting different items. We can also add multiple classes. So if I wanted science and cautious, I can spell cautious, I promise. C-A-U-T-I, oh, yep, there we go. But I don't want to capitalize. So now I have, well, this is of class science and cautious, and I refresh that. Again, no changes yet. But I'm going to go in my, well, let's move my child down. Oops. I'm going to move my child as my second one. Refresh that. And I'm going to add here something to .cautious. I'm going to define a style for that. And for that, I want it to be, let's see, I'm going to change the font size. I'm sticking just with font because it's the most visible and quickly demonstrable CSS attributes. And I'm going to change that font size to 20 pixels. And I'm also going to say the font, I'm going to say weight is going to be bold. Yeah, that should work. So now, when I refresh this, the fact that I have science and cautious, you can see this got a little bigger. And if we, let's make it just stand out a bit more. So let's go to 32 pixels. And I'm going to refresh that. Now, cautious investigators is even bigger and because we're using science and cautious. And if I wanted to add that cautious to this blue one, let's see, here we go, and I save that, now I'm able to, again, layer different classes on and get additional capability, additional look and feel across multiple elements based on just the class, regardless of the element that we're altering. This is a very basic overview of how style sheets work, how classes, IDs, and element definitions work in CSS. And again, we can use our element definitions, class definitions, as well as ID definitions, and combine the three of those things to get some fairly intricate style control over the appearance of our web page. Well, thanks so much. I hope you had a great time watching this, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments or otherwise. Thanks so much, and have a great Monday.